It's an amazing fact about certain philosophers that they continue to have an influence that lasts for centuries and vastly exceeds the actual power of their arguments. I mean, if you look at the arguments, they're often not very good, but these guys continue to have a prodigious influence. And Descartes is my favorite example. It's a striking fact that we continue to pose and answer questions in terms that Descartes really popularized, in terms that he would have found completely comfortable and completely familiar to him. And in particular, this distinction between the mental and the physical, mind and the body, the spiritual and the material, and the idea that all of reality must divide into those two categories. That's really Descartes' great articulation of that. He didn't invent it, of course, but the articulation is one that we have inherited from him. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to come dead to grips with Descartes and try to give direct answers to his questions. Remember, I said in an earlier lecture that there are 6 serious problems with Cartesian dualism, and I think I have proposed an alternative to that. The alternative, you remember, is to say, well, there's a causal relation between brain and mind. What we think of as mental states are caused by lower-level neuronal processes, but they're just features of the brain. There's no separate metaphysical category. How then do I fare with Descartes' problems? How then does this view... it's easier to talk about a view if you give it a name. So I like to call my view biological naturalism. It's too many syllables. I mean, it's longer than dualism, but I want a label that gets out of the traditional monism, materialism, dualism, because I think those labels are half of our problem. If we can shuck off all of that dreadful terminology, if we can get rid of the nomenclature, then it's not a big deal to solve the mind-body problem. I'm envious of a friend of mine from Africa who told me in his tribe in Africa, they can't even state the mind-body problem. They don't have this vocabulary. We think it's inevitable that everybody must have a dualistic vocabulary, but it's not. It's a feature. It's appealing, as I said. I mean, I once lectured in Bombay, and I was on the same platform with the Dalai Lama, and I was struck by the fact that he used the Cartesian categories. But though it's pervasive, it's not inevitable, and it's not universal. So if we reject the vocabulary and we adopt a theory of the sort that I call biological naturalism, where are we with Descartes' problems? Well, let's go through. Let's go through the 6 problems that I said any Cartesian had. The first is the big one. How can there be a causal relation between the mind and the body? How can there be causal relations between the mental and the physical? And there I think the answer is if you reject the dualistic assumptions that somehow these name mutually metaphysically exclusive categories, it's not a difficult problem at all. It's about like saying, how can there be causal relations between the molecular behavior that composes this solid object and the solidity of the object, the solidity that enables it to support other objects? And the answer is the molecular behavior causes the whole system to be solid, even though the solidity is a feature of the system that's made up of those very molecules. And exactly analogously, the neuronal behavior causes this system to be conscious, even though the consciousness is a feature of a system that's made of those very micro elements, of those very neurons and synapses. So I think once you get out of 2 mistakes, the idea that there is an irreducible distinction of a metaphysically exclusive kind between the mental and the physical, it's not difficult to see how there can be causal relations. We have to respect how nature actually works, and it's just a fact about nature. We just know it to be a fact that our neuronal processes cause our conscious states. Now, that isn't to say that it's easy to figure out how it works neurobiologically, that it's going to be easy to get a complete neurobiological theory, and in a subsequent lecture I will talk about the difficulties and the prospects of giving a scientific account of consciousness. But the form of the relation does not seem to me difficult. So biological naturalism answers Cartesian dualism by saying two things. Mental states are caused by brain states, and mental states are just features of brains. The idea that there's some inconsistency between those is a result of our having a mistaken notion of causation. We think causation must always be between discrete events in time, but not all causation is like that. There is bottom-up causation, where the behavior of elements at the micro level causes surface features such as liquidity and solidity. But that doesn't yet answer the question that especially bothered the Cartesians. How do we avoid epiphenomenalism? How do we avoid the view that the mind can't make any difference? Because if the mind is just this surface feature, how does it actually affect the physical world? And as I mentioned, we know, in fact, that it does affect the physical world. I decide to raise my arm, and my arm goes up. It's just a fact that my conscious intentions and decisions affect my physical behavior. We know that with more certainty than we know just about anything in any philosophical argument. Our question now is, how can that be the case? How can it be the case that consciousness can actually move matter, that my conscious decision to raise my arm can cause my arm to go up? To answer that question, I have to introduce a distinction that we've been using implicitly, and that is the distinction between the description of the same system at different levels, at a micro level and at a macro level. Now, we can give a micro level description of my arm going up in terms of the neuron firings and the neurotransmitters. I won't give it in detail, but in a broad outline, what happens is this. There are a series of neuron firings which cause and realize my intention. They reach the motor cortex, and a series of neuron firings from the motor neurons extend all the way to the axon end plates of my muscles. And we actually know the neurotransmitter that carries this signal from the brain to the muscles. It's called acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine at the synaptic connections produces a sequence of neuron firings until we actually reach the axon end plates of the motor neurons. And these axon end plates are latched right onto the muscles. Now, they secrete calcium ions, and the calcium ions attack the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber, and there's a kind of ratcheting effect with the myosin filaments and the actin filaments, and they crank up the arm. That is, there's a story to be told at the micro level about how the whole thing occurs in terms of neuron firings at synapses and the biochemical effect of all of that on the muscle structures when we reach the neuromuscular junction. Okay, that's one story. Now our question is, how does that story relate to another story? I decided to raise my arm, I tried to do it, the damn thing went up. All right, so we got two different stories. One's about acetylcholine, neuromuscular junctions. The other's about intention and bodily movements. It seems to me those two stories are perfectly consistent with each other, and they're both true. They just describe the same phenomenon at different levels. And we know that nature works like that. We know there are all kinds of examples like that. Let me give an example from an artifact because it illustrates the point. When your car starts, there are two different stories. There's one story to be told at the level of the spark plugs and the gasoline and the cylinder. And what happens is the spark plug sets off an explosion, and that series of explosions becomes self-sustaining through the operation of the pistons in the connected to the crankshaft. But of course there's another story to be told at the micro level. What happens at the micro level is the passage of electrons between the electrodes of the spark plug heats, that is to say, it increases the molecular movement of the hydrocarbons to the point that you reach the kindling point, and the hydrocarbons oxidize, and the oxidization becomes self-sustaining. Now, which is the real story? The story about the spark plugs and the explosion, or the story about the oxidization of hydrocarbons and the passage of the electrons? It seems to me they're both right. They're both true stories. Of course, we always think the more fundamental story is at the micro level, and as far as our theory of the universe is concerned, that's right. But that doesn't mean the macro level story is false or useless. On the contrary, it's perfectly true. When you take your car to your mechanic, what do you say? Do you say the oxidization of the hydrocarbons is no longer sufficiently self-sustaining, or do you say the damn thing won't start? I think it's the plugs. Well, I know what I would say. I would forget about the hydrocarbons. I would say I think I need new plugs because my car won't start. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. It isn't as if, well, you didn't really tell us the honest to John truth. No, you do tell the truth. Now, it's true. Where I live in Berkeley, there are a lot of auto mechanics who are unemployed PhDs, and them you better talk about hydrocarbons. But still, that's a special, that's a special local problem. Anyway, the point I'm making now is, once we demystify the subject, once we demystify the mind-body relation, and just think of it as these are ordinary biological phenomena, then there's no big deal in thinking about how it can be the case that when I decide to raise my arm and my arm goes up, there's a causal relation, just as when in the same sense of causal relation as when the neuron firings reach the motor, reach the axon end plates of the motor neurons and begin to affect the muscle fibers. Those are not two different and competing stories. Those are two non-competing stories about the same system. They just describe that system at different levels. So the answer to the problem of epiphenomenalism is that there can be causal relations within a system at different levels, and the causal relations are real at each level. Car engines is one of the few things I understand fairly well. Think of the piston. Now, the solidity of the piston is explainable in terms of the behavior of the molecules, but that doesn't mean solidity is epiphenomenal. You've got to have a solid piston. You can't make a piston out of butter, for example, because the car won't work. So solidity is real, even though the solidity is itself explained by the behavior of the molecules, and in exactly that sense I want to say consciousness is real. It's a real causal force in the world, even though, of course, it is a feature of a system that is composed of neurons, and the conscious feature is caused by the behavior of the neurons. All right, that's always our first question then. What is the nature of the mind-body interaction, and how can we answer that question in a way that avoids epiphenomenalism? But now then, let's go to Descartes' second question. How do I know other people have consciousness and mental states at all? All I observe is their behavior. Maybe they're just robots. How do I really know that other people have conscious states? And I mentioned that the standard answer to that, the Cartesian style answer, was the argument from analogy. I know by analogy from my own case. I observe that their behavior matches their input stimuli in a way that's like mine, so I postulate or infer that there's something going on inside them that's like what's going on inside me. I think that answer is wrong. If we took that answer seriously, then the reasonable thing to conclude would be that other people don't have conscious states, because what I observe is a disanalogy between me and other people. I observe that when I hit my thumb with a hammer, there's a pain, and I observe when I hit your thumb with a hammer, I don't feel anything. So it looks like solipsism is right. How do we avoid solipsism on my view? Well, there's a feature that got left out of the story, and that's the feature of causation. I don't just observe that you have a body and your body behaves like mine, but I have pretty good reason to suppose that your body's got a structure like my structure, that the effect of a hammer hitting your thumb is causally like the effect of a hammer hitting my thumb. I don't have to have a fancy theory about neurobiology. I don't have to know about the C fibers and the A delta fibers and the role of the thalamus. But I do have to know similar causes produce similar effects. And if you got a body that's like mine, then I can be pretty sure that it's going to have the same causal relations or similar causal relations to mine. Now, that isn't to say that we have perfect knowledge of other people's minds. I think there is a real problem here. It isn't just a philosopher's worry about how can we know that other people have minds and how can we know their thoughts and feelings. I think there's a sense in which you never have a complete understanding of somebody else's mind. Other people are always capable of surprising you. And there may be certain kinds of people or certain sorts of people where you really don't know what it feels like to be that sort of person. I have no idea what it feels like to be Princess Diana, let's say. I mean, it's not a lot, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it, but it's just not a lifestyle that's like mine. I have no idea what it feels like to be Princess Diana, but I do have a pretty good idea to know what it feels like to be Princess Diana when she's hit her thumb with a hammer, because that kind of crude relationship I can figure out just on the basis of very general causal principles. So the point is this. The principle on which I know that other people are conscious and the principle on which I know that they have such and such conscious states is not the principle same behavior, therefore same conscious state. The principle is same sorts of causes, therefore same sorts of effects. I know that other people have the thoughts and feelings roughly similar to mine because I can see they got a causal structure in the environment that's roughly similar to mine. So I don't think there is a serious question about the possibility of knowledge of other minds, though I grant you there are difficulties about specific cases. But even that, what I've said to you, seems to me to concede too much to the other guys. Now, why? You see, I have been talking as if Descartes' problem, how can we really know that other people have consciousness? I've been talking as if that were a real problem. And Descartes, I think, left us with not one, but two bad legacies. The first legacy was the mind-body distinction. But a second legacy that's equally bad is the idea that my basic relations to reality are cognitive knowledge relations, that I'm constantly going through the world finding out about whether or not other people have minds and whether or not there is an external world and whether or not the future will resemble the past and so on. And that is the basic picture that Descartes gives us of our situation in the world is epistemic. It has to do with knowledge. We're constantly trying to make inferences to figure out what we can really know. We stand in an epistemic relation to reality, and that seems to me wrong. Epistemology is a rather limited role in our life. When I came into this room and started talking, I didn't think, aha, they are all conscious. I can infer that they are conscious from their behavior. No, I just take it for granted. I didn't think the floor is solid. I can infer that the floor is solid on the basis of my previous experiences with floors. I didn't do any of that. I just took it for granted. Most of our relationships to the world and to other people are not epistemic except in odd little corners. What's that guy driving at? Or what? Is he really awake or asleep? Those are odd cases. In the standard case, when I get up in the morning and I go to work and I drive my car and I lecture to my students, I am not engaged in solving the other mind's problem or solving the external world problem. So Descartes left us not just with a mistake of thinking we got to reconcile the mind with a body. He left us with a mistake of thinking most of our life is struggling to overcome skepticism, and we're probably not making it. We're probably not proving to his satisfaction or ours that other people are really conscious. I think it's not a serious question. Let me just nail this point home by going to another Cartesian problem, and that's animals. I'm absolutely confident that my dog Ludwig is completely conscious. Now, there are times when I think, well, you ought to take Descartes seriously in the Cartesian and look at him and say, you're just a mechanical beast. You're just a robot. You don't have any feelings. I can't do it. I mean, Ludwig comes rushing out, wagging his tail, jumping all over me, and I say, just a mechanical a piece of machinery, no consciousness at all. I can't do that. Now, why not? Is it because I am so sentimental or so irrational about dogs that I think he's conscious in the face of the Cartesian arguments? No, I think the answer is because I can see that he's got the right kind of structure. Those are his eyes, this is his nose, those are his ears. Why did Lyndon Johnson get in so much trouble when he lifted those doggies by the ears? Lost, I guess, 1 million votes. The answer is we all know what it felt like. I mean, your ears hurt because you could see what he was doing to those dogs. Now, this is the principle on which we know about other people and animals, that they have thoughts and feelings. We can see the causal structure. We can see the effect of causation on their bodies, on their real beast in real life. This is why, by the way, we're not so sure about crabs or grasshoppers or ants. I have no idea if snails are conscious. You know, I'll leave that to the experts. But when it comes to dogs and monkeys and cats, I don't have any problem. They're certainly conscious. Snails, we'll leave that to the experts to figure out. Now, I once made the mistake of saying that at a lecture in Columbia, and the world's leading authority on snail neurobiology was in the audience, and she was outraged that anybody could be so dumb as not to know that snails were conscious. Okay, fine. I can give it to her. But about snails, she has to convince me. But when it comes to dogs and cats, no problem. I mean, I've got the conclusive basis. Okay, so far so good. We just seem to be moving through the Cartesian questions. But let's move on now to the general problem of skepticism. You mean, remember, Descartes had a special problem about our knowledge of other minds. How do I know other people are conscious? But now there is a special problem about the external world, and that's more general than the problem about other minds. How do I know there's a real world out there at all? How do I know there's something on the other side of my experiences? And Descartes' way of posing that doesn't make it clear what the actual problem is for him. The problem is that he thinks, as in this picture of the representative theory, that all we actually perceive are our own experiences. I had to put them outside the head because I didn't have room inside the head, but basically that's all you can actually perceive, are your own ideas, or as they're called in the 20th century, sense data. And then the problem arises, how do you know that the ideas resemble objects in the world, that you can actually find out about objects in the world from looking at your ideas? And the part of his answer for that was, well, the objects cause your ideas, and God has to guarantee that you have accurate knowledge, otherwise he'd be a deceiver. But that looks like it leads to skepticism. It looks like you can never really know anything, because there's no way you can ever check this inference. No way you can know that the ideas or sense data or experiences that you do perceive are giving you accurate information about the real world that you don't perceive. Whereas on my account, there's no problem. On my account, in the normal perceptual situation, you just see the object directly. Your perception reaches right up to the object. It isn't that all you see is your own perception, and then you have to figure out whether or not there's an object on the other side. No, in the standard perceptual case, when you're looking at an object at point-blank range in good light, you directly see the object. So the general skepticism that afflicts Cartesian theories of perception is not one that my view is subject to. Now, that isn't to say it's not subject to any arguments. There are all these other questions which are the stock in trade of traditional epistemology. How do I know I'm not a brain in a vat? How do I know that I'm not having a hallucination? And so on. There are all of these. How do I know I'm not dreaming? And there are things to be said about each of those. But the general form of Cartesian skepticism about perception, how do I justify the inference from my perceptual experience to the real world, That's not a question that arises, on my view, because there is no inference. I don't infer that someone is sitting there. I just see that someone is sitting there. No inference is involved at all. So just to summarize that point, there are a very large number of questions about epistemology and skepticism. I don't solve all of them, but there's a special form of skepticism that Descartes is subject to that a realist view or a naive realist view is not subject to, because Descartes is required to justify the inference from what we do perceive, our own ideas, to the real world that we don't perceive. And on my view, we perceive the real world, and Descartes' arguments to the contrary are mistaken. All right, I've been putting off the worst problem long enough, and that's the problem of the freedom of the will. Now, Descartes does not have a satisfactory answer to that problem, and I have to say, neither do I. In fact, nobody does, and all I can tell you is the kind of mess we're in. Well, we wouldn't want all philosophical problems to be solved, right? I mean, this is one that's really a mess, and we haven't made any progress on it as far as I can see in the past 1,000 or 2,000 years. So let me at least tell you what the problem is. Here's the problem. As far as we know how the world works, it is what we, broadly speaking, call a physical system or set of interlocking physical systems. On a Newtonian conception of the world, we can think of those systems as completely deterministic. Now, with the advent of quantum mechanics and indeterminacy, we think some of the predictions that we make about the behavior of the physical world are not deterministic, but only statistical. But one thing is clear. Our conception of the physical world that we get from physics and chemistry, whether it's classical or quantum theory, allows no room for the freedom of the will. There's no room for a body to just suddenly decide that it's going to swerve from its direction just because it felt like swerving or just because it wanted to decide to swerve. Okay, that's the argument against the freedom of the will. Now, the argument for the freedom of the will is we experience it all the time. It's just a part of our experience that we make up our mind to do it, and then we do it. Or we don't. It's up to us. Sometimes we make up our mind to do something, and we don't do it, and we know it was entirely up to us. Now, let's put this point precisely. The experience that gives us the conviction of our own free will is the experience of voluntary action in a way where it's part of the experience that the action is itself not sufficiently caused by antecedent events. There are causes. I have beliefs and desires, but given the totality of my beliefs and desires, it's up to me. So I look at the candidates for an election, and I decide, well, I'm going to vote for candidate A. But when I get in the ballot booth, I really still have to do it. It's still up to me. There's a gap in our ordinary experience between the causes of our actions and our actions. And that gap, the experience of that gap, is the experience that gives us the conviction of the freedom of the will. You see, if I fall out of a window, I don't have that feeling. I don't have the feeling I could be doing something else now. It's up to me. Whereas in a normal, everyday situation, I could raise my right arm, or I could raise my left arm, or I could raise neither arm. It's up to me, and it's part of the content of my experiences that it's up to me. And to put that in more precise terms for the present discussion, it's part of the content of my experiences that my ordinary, everyday, non-pathological experiences are such that they are not determined by antecedent causes. It's part of my experience that I sense alternative possibilities open to me. They're not infinite, these possibilities. I don't think I could jump over this building, but I am completely confident that I could raise my left hand or my right hand, or I could wiggle my fingers or not wiggle my fingers, or scratch my head, or change the subject, or do a lot of other things. Now that area, the area of possibilities that are open to us, where the causes of our existing experiences are not sufficient to determine which of those alternatives we're going to select, that is the area of human freedom. And we can't get rid of that. You cannot, if you become convinced that you're not free, you can't live that conviction. You go into a restaurant and they say, well, what do you want from the menu? You can't say, well, I'm a determinist. Que sera, sera. I'll just wait and see what I order. That's no good. You still have to do something. Even if you're convinced that your order is completely determined by your upbringing and your bourgeois predilections or your Freudian repressions, pick your favorite theory of determinism. No matter how much you're convinced, that truth is you still have to make up your mind. Even if you blurt out your decision at the last minute and it surprises even you, it still has to be something you do. So the notion of voluntary action contains the notion of freedom in its very structure. That, by the way, is why it's different from perception. If I look at this glass, I don't have the feeling, well, I'm seeing a glass, but I could decide to see something different. I could see a horse or a dog. No, as long as I'm looking this way, I can change my direction of my head, but as long as I'm looking at this, I'm going to see a cup. And that's because the content of my experience is entirely determined by the physical situation I'm in. But as far as voluntary actions are concerned, I do not think that. I do not think my voluntary actions are completely determined by the situation I'm in. Now, here's the problem. We all have the experience of freedom, and you can't shake it. You cannot subtract it. You can't think, well, I'll just have these experiences without the conviction of freedom, because the conviction of freedom is built into the structure of the experience. The sense of the gap between the causes in the form of your reasons or your previous experiences and the effect in the form of your subsequent actions, the sense of a gap is part of the structure of our consciousness. So here's the contradiction. We have a physics and a chemistry that are completely convincing. We don't have any worries about, are these guys telling us the truth? We've got a convincing account of how the world works physically. There are puzzles. I mean, there are all the puzzles about quantum mechanics, but basically we've got an account of the physical universe. That account allows no room for the freedom of the will. It's sometimes said, well, maybe the statistical indeterminacy of quantum mechanics will allow for it. That's no good, because the statistical gap doesn't allow for particles to decide to move this way or that. It just says if you're trying to predict how the particles will move, you can only make statistical and not deterministic predictions. So we've got an account of the physical universe that leaves no room for the freedom of the will, but we know, all of us knows, we've got freedom of the will. We have our freedom as part of our own experience, and we can't make those two consistent. We don't know how to make them consistent. Now, let me deal with two objections to what I just said. The first objection says, and this is what most philosophers actually believe, look, they would say, you've talked as if freedom of the will and determinism were inconsistent with each other, but they're really perfectly consistent. When you talk about determinism, you're just talking about how the world works as a physical system. And when you talk about freedom, you're just talking about a certain area of determined behavior. So, of course, everything is determined. I mean, give or take statistical determinacy here. But some of your determined behavior is determined by your reasons. It's determined by your thought processes. So, of course, determinism is true, and, of course, freedom of the will is true, because freedom of the will just means freedom from certain kinds of causes. Nobody is putting a gun at my head. I'm not under the influence of drugs. I haven't been hypnotized. So to say that you're free is just to say your behavior is caused by certain kinds of inner causes, your choices and decisions. To say that it's determined is just to say it follows the laws of physics. Everything follows the laws of physics. So determinism and freedom are perfectly compatible with each other. Now that view, as I said, is the view that's most widely accepted in philosophy today, and not surprisingly, it's called compatibilism. It says determinism and free will are completely compatible. But that won't work. Why? Well, to begin with, my actions are not causally determined by my beliefs and desires. There is, as I said, a gap that whatever the cause is, I sense that I could do something different. And it's not enough to just say, well, we can use the words in such a way that we make the claim you are free consistent with the claim you are determined. Because what we want to know is, given that the world was structured causally in a certain way at a certain point, could you have done something different? That is, could you have decided not to vote for such and such a candidate, given that you did decide to vote for that candidate? And the determinist answer to that question is inconsistent with a free will answer. The determinist says, no, given the structure of the world, such and such is going to happen. And the free will answer says, well, it's up to you. You can interfere with the causal order of the world, and we just don't know how to make that consistent with how the world works. So compatibilism, I think, is a cop-out. That is, compatibilism avoids the substantive question by giving us a verbal solution. It says we use the words free and the words determined in such a way that we can make them consistent. But we're not interested in the words here. We're interested in the factual question. In any given decision-making situation, could I have done something different, all other conditions remaining the same? So that we're still left with this problem even after we have the recognition that, yes, there is a use of the words where we say, well, he acted of his own free will, even though we think that the physics completely determined what was going to happen. What we want to know is there any substance to the claim of free will? And that question remains after we have settled all of the verbal issues. Now, there's another objection, in my view, and that's this. Sometimes you have the experience of freedom, but it turns out you were just wrong. And the hypnosis cases are good examples of this. Now, the way the hypnosis cases works is this. You tell the guy under hypnosis, when you come out of hypnosis and you hear the word Germany, you're going to crawl around on the floor. They actually did this in Germany. This is an experiment I'm reporting. You're going to crawl around on the floor. But you're not going to remember that we told you this. So the guy comes out of the hypnosis, and we're sitting around having coffee and talking about how much fun hypnosis is. And we say, you know, I'm thinking of going to Germany for the rest of the summer. And suddenly the guy says, what a fascinating floor in this room. My broker wants me to get into floor tiles, so I hope you don't mind if I inspect the tiles here. I'm thinking of making a big investment. I really have deep reasons why I got to inspect these tiles. And then he gets down and crawls around on the floor. Now, the interesting thing is this, you see. The subjects always give a perfectly plausible sounding explanation for why they're doing what they're doing, but we know they're wrong. That's not the reason the guy's crawling around on the floor. It's got nothing to do with his broker or investing in Armstrong tiles. The guy's crawling around on the floor because we told him to during the hypnosis. So the hypothesis here would be the experience of freedom is an illusion, and we know it's an illusion because there are lots of illusory cases like the hypnosis cases. But let's think about that. You see, that doesn't seem to me satisfactory as an answer to the puzzle we had about freedom and determinism, because we know in advance the hypnosis cases are not typical. I mean, we don't want to say all our life we're going through life hypnotized, right? That's just wrong. Hypnosis is a very special kind of case. So I think in a way the hypnosis cases support the contrast between genuine free behavior and illusory freedom, because they are a special kind of case where we have very good reason for supposing the reasons according to which the agent is acting are not his or her not the reasons that he or she takes to be the reasons. The real reasons are not the reason that the agent thinks that he or she is acting on. But that's unusual. That's not the standard case when I'm voting for a candidate or deciding what to choose in a restaurant. So I think we're still left with this question. And in my most pessimistic moments, I think, Maybe evolution just played a huge trick on us. It gave us the conviction of our own free will, and we can't shake it, but it just doesn't fit in the world. The world cannot be the way we take it to be. We're just mistaken in thinking we have free will. In fact, the world is a set of determined, as again, give or take quantum statistical determinacy. The world is a set of determined systems, and we're determined like any other biological system. The cruelty, the paradox here is we can't believe that. We can't live it. We can't accept it. So even if you became convinced of that, the moment you walk out of this room, you'll act as if you were free because you have no choice. So in my most pessimistic moments, I'm inclined to think, well, maybe we're just determined to hold a false belief in our own free will. Now, in my more optimistic moments, I think, well, we don't know as much about the world and about biology as we like to think. I mean, we make all of these, we have a certain arrogance about how much we know, but in fact, we've got a lot to learn, and there's a whole lot more to be learned about human behavior, about physics, and the nature of causation, and we won't have a satisfactory answer to the question of freedom and determinism until we know a whole lot more about biology and about the physics of biology. So in a way, my situation with the free will problem is worse than Descartes. Because Descartes at least had a consistent position, even though it was vacuous. He says, well, we're free when we feel free, but then he doesn't answer the question, well, how could our conscious thoughts make any difference to the actual physical world? On my view, there's a straight inconsistency. I got a straight logical contradiction between my conviction as an amateur physicist that there's no space for free will in the world, and my conviction as a rational agent that my behavior is free, within certain limits, of course, but it's not determined. So I just leave you with that inconsistency. Well, there are a couple more problems in Descartes. I mentioned the problem of animals, and we now see that there is no difficulty in postulating that animals have a consciousness, that animals have minds. It's just a feature of their biology that their brains are so much like ours that it would be absurd to suppose. I mean, the chimpanzee's brain is really strikingly like a human brain. It would be incredible to suppose that our brains produce consciousness, but their brains do not. And so on down the phylogenetic scale. How far down, I don't really know. About sleep, there's no difficulty in saying that a system which is capable of consciousness can become unconscious during sleep or a coma or other sorts of forms of unconsciousness. It's simply that consciousness is a state the brain is in under certain circumstances, and we're not always in that state. Now, there was one point in Descartes which has been massively rejected in the 20th century, and that is Descartes thought all mental states were by definition conscious. He wouldn't have had any use for the notion of an unconscious mental state. Now, in the 20th century, largely under the influence of Freud, but other people as well, Freud didn't invent the idea of the unconscious, we have come to believe that many of our mental states are unconscious. We have come to believe that in addition to our conscious states, we have a vast inventory of unconscious mental states. And we've now come to the point where we talk very glibly about our unconscious mental states. And I think many people accept Freud's conception that somehow or other consciousness is kind of the abnormal thing. Remember, Freud says mental states in themselves are unconscious, and consciousness is like an island in the sea of the unconscious. So there's this vast unconscious, and then there's this little island of consciousness sticking up. Now, this is not a problem that Descartes had because he didn't think there were such things as unconscious mental states. We are now convinced that he was wrong. There are such things as unconscious mental states, but that is more problematic than we think. We ought to be puzzled by that. We need to answer the question, what exactly is the nature of consciousness? And then we'll be able to answer the question, well, what's the nature of the unconscious? Those will be topics for the next lecture.